What is belonging? And how do we get more of it? What can I do to feel more human, more connected to others? Who do I even belong to? Friends, this is what we are chasing today. Writer David Brooks says in his book, How to Know a Person, that human beings need recognition as much as they need food and water. No crueler punishment, he thinks, can be devised than to not see someone. David Brooks says later in the book that there's a precondition to seeing people well. He tells the story of a man that I actually know from Waco, Texas, Jimmy Dorrell. Jimmy created a church for people experiencing homelessness that meets under a freeway. I've actually visited Jimmy's church. I've seen what David Brooks writes about Jimmy firsthand. And he says these words on page 31. And I have to just read them to you because his description of Jimmy is so beautiful, which also is like an invitation to all of us. He writes, when Jimmy sees a person, any person, he is also seeing a creature endowed with an immortal soul, a soul of infinite value and dignity. When Jimmy greets a person, he is also trying to live up to one of the great callings of his faith. He is trying to see that person the way Jesus would see that person. He goes on to write, now you may be an atheist, an agnostic, a Christian, a Jew, a Muslim, a Buddhist, or something else. But this posture of respect and reverence, this awareness of the infinite dignity of each person you meet, is a precondition for seeing people well. I love that. There is something to this for me, something about seeing and being seen that makes us feel a sense of belonging. It helps us to feel more human. Gregory Ellison is Associate Professor of Pastoral Care and Counseling at Candler School of Theology, which is at Emory University, and he's the co-founder of something called Fearless Dialogues. I went to one of his talks, and he begins the whole workshop walking around the room, looking at everyone in the eyes, saying, it's good to see you today. And it's a really powerful experience. It's good to see you today. To multiple people for several minutes as he begins his workshop. Throughout history, numerous authors have written about the woes of not belonging and of the deep human longing for connection, identity, and acceptance. Like Maya Angelou, her book, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, tells her story of the people she lived with and did life with alongside of, but most of whom she never truly belonged to. She eventually finds her voice and her own self-acceptance, but along the way, she experiences profound pain, the pain of not feeling like she belonged. I was a part of a research group who discussed belonging and wrote about it together for a year. As a group, we discerned that belonging has at least 5 dimensions that are really important to consider. First, the first is consequences. Our team viewed belonging as David Brooks did, as a matter, or as he does, as a matter of life and death. The second dimension is place. Belonging takes place. It's embodied and particular, and it's carried forth by the ways our bodies move through the various places that we live in or that we inhabit. It also has conditions. That's the third dimension. Belonging doesn't just happen, it's cultivated over time under particular conditions. Fourth, it involves practice. It's nurtured over time in the company of others and for the sake of others. And it's also 5, communal. We can only extend belonging when we've learned to receive it from others. So it's sort of like caught, not as much as like taught. This generational reality, the transmission of values and practices from ancestors to those who follow, cultivates wisdom and care. And my guest today knows a lot about this. He's the perfect person to talk with about the relationship between belonging and feeling deeply human, as well as the role that we individuals play and organizations play in cultivating belonging. Rabbi Elan Babchuck is committed to leaving behind a world that is more compassionate and connected than the one he found. In pursuit of that commitment, he serves as the executive vice president at KOL, the National Jewish Center for Learning and Leadership. And he's the founding executive director of Glean Network, which partners with Columbia Business School. He was ordained in 2012 as a rabbi and earned his MBA that year as well. He's a sought-after thought leader. He has delivered keynotes at stages ranging from TEDx to the U.S. Army's General Officer Symposium. He's published in The Atlantic, The Guardian, Washington Post, and Religion News Service, and he's a column for the Wisdom Daily. He is also the co-author of Picking Up the Pieces, Leadership After Empire, which we're going to touch on today in this conversation, as well as he's also contributed to Meaning Making, a book about 8 values that drive America's newest generations. He's a founding board member of Springtide Research Institute, which focuses on spirituality, mental health, and Gen Z. And he's a founding partner of Starts With Us, a movement to counteract toxic polarization in America. I mean, we need him. We need his work. He lives in Providence, Rhode Island with his wife, Lizzie Pollock, and their 3 children, Micah, Nessa, and Isla. In his spare time, he's an avid rock climber and a constant gardener. Rabbi Babchuck, welcome to the show. I'm so happy to have you here today.
Thank you so much, Angela, for having me. This is just an incredible joy, and I've so appreciated the opportunity to get to know you. And I look forward to diving in and just sort of seeing where this conversation is going to take us.
Yeah, me too. I think this is a topic that both of us are really passionate about. We've both researched this and thought about it over the last few years. So I'm excited to see where there's synchronicity, similarities between our work. I think if we were to ask 100 different people, what is your definition of belonging, that they might have 100 different answers. And so I'm really interested in your definition as someone who thinks about this all the time, who consults on belonging for organizations, who's written on it. What is belonging?
Great. There's funny in the Jewish community we have a saying, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. And I feel like it's sort of a way of poking fun at ourselves that actually what we're really good about is seeing both sides of an argument and being able to see the partial truth in all of them and staying in that tension, in that dialogue. And I would say you ask 10 sociologists the definition, or 10 workplace consultants or 10 CEOs, and you will find 1,000 definitions of belonging. And I actually think that's a good thing. I think if we had a monolithic understanding of what it is, then we'd probably develop, because this is what we do in our culture, a monolithic approach. And that won't work, because belonging means something different to each individual person, to each community, in each space. It is contextual. And so the first thing I'll say is, I'm going to give you a definition, which is just really simple. It's having an affinity for a place, having an affinity for a community, having an affinity for a situation even. But where I want to get a little more granular, and this is with a hat tip to the Springtide Research Institute, which I've worked really closely with over these last 4 or 5 years. And they developed a belonging index, and they had 3 stages. The first stage is being noticed, then being named, and then being known. So real belongingness involves all 3 of those facets from their research perspective. Now, when my organization began partnering with them to bring this survey index into faith communities all around the country, we added one more, and that's to be needed. From our humble perspective, and what the data was clearly telling us, is that you can be noticed and you can be named and you can be known, but all of those are passive experiences. When we teach that belonging is a passive experience, it puts the onus only on the host, only on the community leader, only on the whoever's running the organization, the institution, the company, any of those things. And it takes the responsibility, it takes the opportunity for agency off of the individual who themselves are seeking, are yearning for that experience of belonging. To be needed means that there is a match for the gifts that you bring into the world and for the place where you seek solace.
Do you feel like we sort of have a crisis of belonging
in present day United States, like we'll just talk about our nation right now where we live. We could think about the world globally, but like to be more specific, in the United States, do we have a crisis of belonging or failed belongingness on the part, or how would you put that?
So I'll answer. First, let me tell you why I don't think we do, and then I'm
Okay.
going to tell you what I actually believe, which is that we do. So here's why I don't think we do. Because this is a made-up term. And we just kind of made up belonging when it entered the cultural. I mean, if you look at the Google Ngram, it's like 2021, and we have a hockey stick graph where all of a sudden everyone is talking about belonging, which, by the way, is awesome. We should be talking about belonging. When there is, and there is a particular group, I think in America, it's a term that is much more commonly found in progressive circles, like as you and I tend to run in. I think the fact that this is a new term, a new concept, the definitions around it are so ephemeral. They shift every couple of months. We have a new layer to this idea of belonging. So what it means is that we're also then, we're creating the definitions. We sort of invented the concept, and we're the ones who have to advance the field, right? Building out the field means that we have to create guideposts around it, trainings around it, workshops, and we have to encourage people to buy into the notion. So to say that we have a crisis of belonging, it's not so dissimilar from, like if we looked at the entertainment industry and then saw that nobody's renting movies anymore, and you could say, well, there's a crisis of entertainment. It's like, no, the things have shifted, the definitions have shifted, and now we're in the nascent stages of trying to understand what this is, how to measure it, and how to cultivate it. Now, I do believe we have a crisis of belonging. I fully believe that this is a really important lens that we should be looking at on society. But I think on the deeper level, maybe that goes beyond belonging, is that I think we have a crisis of identity in the country. I think we have a crisis of narrative in the country, where for a large segment of our population now genuinely feels like the stories that they were told about this country, the stories that they were told about what it means to be a part of this country, what it means to belong in America or not belong in America, that there are real cracks in the facade of those clean stories that were shared with them or that were taught to them. And the reaction when that story breaks is a crisis of self, a crisis of identity, and a crisis of narrative. And I think as a country, not only do we have to reweave the social fabric, which has so clearly been torn, but we actually have to rewrite a new narrative about what it means to belong in America. What does it mean to be an American? If I described someone as patriotic 30 years ago, you would say, yeah, I'm patriotic too. Wonderful. That's a nice thing to say. And now the term is so loaded that it only falls into one political category to be quote unquote patriotic. Well, what does it mean to still be proud to be an American? Can you even say that anymore? So as definitions and contexts and connotations continue to shift, and they shift really, really fast, it would be very easy to land just on the notion that it's a crisis of belonging. My argument here is that it's one or two levels deeper. It's a crisis of self, identity, and narrative that we need to really reweave.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly helpful. When I think too about so many people who grew up in particular faith traditions, and then as they've aged, and we're seeing this, increasingly over the last decade, the last 20 years, people leaving the faith traditions they were nurtured into. And then that definitely creates this crisis of identity. Who am I now? But then also, like, what narratives then shape my sense of what it means to live a good life, of where I'm going, of who I belong to. So I think about it as place, like you were talking about, and location, country, and the narratives that are in that faith tradition. And then also I think about it a lot in workplace terms. And I'm wondering what you would say, especially as someone who does a lot of consulting with organizations, like, what's the crisis of belonging? How is that new or different in recent years? What's going on with that?
Great. Yeah. Look, I think the first thing is that people are even experiencing a need to belong in the workplace. That is a new thing, right?
Okay.
30 years ago, that didn't exist. Part of the reason why that exists is because Fortune 500 CEOs in the early 90s realized that if they talk about work, along with meaning making and purpose finding. And if people are then finding meaning making meaning at work, building community at work, and of course, like and finding their purpose, the version of this that's like on steroids is Silicon Valley, where they're sleeping at work and they're playing
Yeah.
at work and they're meeting their spouses at work and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And they're encouraged to do that. Why? Because it's more free labor. So when we seek out belonging at work, which unfortunately is sort of the expectation now, when we seek that out, it is so that we will then be more likely to stay at work for longer hours, which are often unpaid if you're a salaried employee. That shift happened 30 some odd years ago. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. This really, yeah. Okay. This makes me think of Anne Helen Peterson's work, her book, Can't Even, the Burnout, how millennials became the burnout generation. Love her work. I love her cultural studies, and her essays are just always amazing. And I think it was in that book, but maybe somewhere else. But I read about an economist, and I think the pulse that she has on the sort of cultural shifts are really help. Like basically, if you're loving what Rabbi Babchuck is saying right now, read Can't Even, because I think she really gets at the heart of this, of how Google and other tech companies, they said, make your whole life here, and then they got to benefit from it. And so I think she does some really good work in that. But there was an economist in the 1950s that wrote a really interesting essay that said that he imagined that in the 2000s, we would have a 15-hour work week. And then he was trying to imagine, I don't know if you read this article or heard about this, right? He was trying to imagine what people would do with all this leisure and free time, right? He was like, what will they do because in 15 hours a week, they'll be able to pay for their lives, so they won't have to work as hard. And what he didn't realize, and I've written since about this, is that work would go from a means of money production to a means of identity production. It would go from making money to making a self. So I see the progression here and how we got here.
Yeah.
But then it makes me wonder, well, then should companies not care about belonging? Should we not try to get belonging at work? Or now that we've gotten here, what do we do?
It's a great question. I think, first of all, companies, it is on them to create a place of belonging for their employees. And it is also incumbent on those employees or the people who are potentially going to work at that place or considering working at a place to see, hey, is there an alignment here? Are my gifts going to be valued in a place like this? Let me talk to 5 people who used to work there who left. It's a vetting process in which the person needs to then say, what is it going to take for me? What do I need to do in order to experience that sense of belonging, to find my purpose here at this place? That's a hard thing to do, but that's one step. I think the other piece of it is, gosh, in an ideal world, no, we would not necessarily we'd be working 15 hours a week, I guess, according to that economist. But what's interesting is those early projections are from the economists, and this does tie to belonging. Their early projections was, with the advance of technology, with the growths in productivity, assuming they're evenly distributed, which of course is a false assumption, yes, advances in technologies will mean we will buy more leisure time. And when the dishwasher came about, you got 30 minutes back every evening or every 2. You're not washing the dishes anymore. What did you do with those 30 minutes? I don't know. You played a game of bridge with your family. You took a walk around the block. You played with the dog. Whatever it is you did, it was for you to decide. Now, that was before technology began getting designed by folks with backgrounds in addictive behavior, right? They're created by behaviorists. And many of these technologies, then, all of the technologies that we have now, many of which we shape our identities around, whether it's your social media following. Apple was the first company in the tech world to successfully align one's self-identity and affiliation with a tech company. To say I own the iPhone when everyone else was on, a Palm Pilot was a major stake in the ground.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, with that the advances in those technologies and many of the ones that we're talking about now, what they actually do is they encourage you to build your life, to shape your identity around those technologies, those platforms, those spaces, such that the only time that you ever feel a sense of belonging or think you feel a sense of belonging is when you're using those products or when you're on those platforms. And that's where it becomes really dangerous. That, as you mentioned, we used to create these spaces, this sense of belonging in faith communities, right? But with 10,000 churches and synagogues and mosques closing in America every single year for the last 14 years, on average, 10,000 closing, now we have a huge cultural, spiritual, and communal vacuum when nature abhors a vacuum. So what's happening to the people who would have generationally been joining the church and finding their community there and creating a sense of belonging are now looking for that belonging somewhere else. It is a timeless scratch that humanity has always wanted to itch. And ways and the places and spaces where they're seeking that out are actually, in my argument here, is they're doing a great deal of harm.
What I hear you saying is that when we say we're searching for belonging, we want more belonging. What we're saying, what I hear you saying, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, is we're searching for a self. We're searching for identity. We're searching for a narrative that we can belong to and live toward, that makes sense, that feels right. So if I'm a person who's searching for this in my life, if I'm listening to you right now, listening to us have this conversation, and I'm thinking, I want more of that. Yes, Elan, like, I want more of that. Like, how? Where do I start? What would you say to that individual? And then I do want to hear what you talk to organizations about as well, and especially in light of your new book. But like to individuals, or is it different at all? Maybe it's not different.
So the first thing I'd say is if you have parents or elders, if you have mentors in your life, ask them where they went to find a sense of belonging. Ask them how they went about their lives, how they organized their lives around finding that and cultivating that and then creating it for others, if they were a part of doing that. And try to look, the easiest answer would be to say, oh, your parents were members of a church, go find your local church and do the same exact thing. And you might say, no, actually the church is not a safe place for me. And I left the church for reason A, B, and C. And that's real. So one has to also listen to one's own lived experience in order to find those places and spaces. But I would say never let perfect get in the way of good or good enough. Who is one person that you feel a sense of belonging with, that you can just be yourself, that you can sit, even if it's just sitting in silence with, even if it's not a community, it's not an organization, it's not a company, it's not even a place, it's just one person. Start with that one person. And that's the first stepping stone to building a sense of belonging in broader communities. What I would also say is this, is start with yourself. To what extent do you feel a real, abiding, deep sense of belonging in your own body? Because so much of what we do and look, maybe you have a listener out there who literally is listening to this podcast to avoid going to yoga, right? Which they know they want to do and they know it would help them. It's a great embodied practice, but they're like, it's so much more interesting or whatever. But so much of what we do is actually so that we can be distracted from what it means to simply sit in our bodies and be ourselves and wrestle with what it means to be human in a really complicated, sometimes ugly, always messy world. So that's the first step, I think, is just what does it mean for you to belong in your own skin, in your own body, in your own shoes, in your own context, in your own lived experience? And what can you learn from that such that you can actually become a teacher at the next community that you want to be a part of, the next organization, the next company? You are an expert in your own belonging, which means that you actually have an incredible gift to teach them, which is this is what it would take for this to be a place where I would love to rest my head, hang my hat, hang my shingle, work with others, whatever it is that, pray to my God. That means you have to be the expert there and you have to share that wisdom with others in a really, sometimes you have to be more patient than you'd like to be because it takes communities and leaders a long time to come along.
Yeah, it makes me think too of just, I've been thinking a lot lately and writing about the stories that make us. And I think so. When I hear you say like turn to an elder, turn to somebody who's older than you, and ask them about their experiences of identity, of belonging. It makes me think of like looking back as we're trying to find ourselves again. Remembering the other day I posted on social media, think about the people who have called you in and who have called things, named things in you. Try to recall them to mind, your mentors, your coaches, your teachers, your friends, your family. There is wisdom in the faces of the people who have loved you and in their words. And so I think I love this invitation to say to them, like, look within yourself, but like, think about where you've come from. Think about the stories that have made you and your community. I think about Anne Streety Wemberly's work. She's an incredible religious educator, and she talks about in her book about stories, about the communal stories that need to be passed on to people about how we've overcome that's such an important thing, And so asking our elders, looking at our ancestor stories and thinking about what suffering did they overcome? What are the stories that they lived? In what ways did they fight for us to have the life that we have? And that there's a lot of, I think, identity and belonging in that. When you are giving advice, consulting, talking with organizations who are trying to cultivate more belonging, I imagine that you probably start with noticing, but could you say more about what you advise them to do, and especially like the 4 N's that you've come up with the Springtide Research Institute?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to first lift up something you just said, which just struck, and that was so powerful, what you just shared. When I referred earlier to this notion of a crisis of narrative in the country, that there's, real people who are saying, wait a second, you taught me one thing about Christopher Columbus, and then all I had to do was like Google it. And are you kidding me? I didn't learn anything about that. October 13th, same different every. So I think what that does, because there's real hurt in that revelation for the individual who is feeling that disconnect from what it means to be American or the narratives that have been given, and it creates that crisis narrative. What it also does is it puts us on a historical island. It forces us to actually imagine that this moment is the only moment in history. By the way, nobody's studying history anymore. No, it's like the first thing to go after arts. It's the first thing to go when public schools have budget cuts. No, there goes history, right? And because we don't need to learn it. All you need to do is Google, hey, what happened in the Civil War? And then you read 4 sentences, and then you think you know about the Civil War, right? Because we're not studying history anymore, when we have that crisis of narrative where we break with our ancestors, where we break with the history that's been given to us, puts us on a historical island such that we think nobody before me has ever dealt with adversity the way I've dealt with adversity.
Yep.
The entirety of the future of humankind is on my shoulders, and whatever I do next is going to determine the fate of my people. Now, that is a terrible place to be. That's not, I love going to islands as much as the next person. That is not an island that I want to be on. And when we talk about so many young people who are experiencing unprecedented levels of anxiety and mental health breakdowns and isolation, loneliness is one thing, isolation is different. They are isolated on that island. And what you just offered was, hey, talk to an elder who's been through something hard. Right? There are all of those studies about multi-generational communities. And when people live in multi-generational community, I have living proof of somebody who's twice my age, who has been through so many hard things, and they're still standing, and they have stories to tell me about it. That is such a critical part of belonging. And to now pivot to the next question you asked about, what advice do I give employers? I think the same thing is true, right? Even if you've been around, even if it's a startup company, there is a history to the startup, because chances are there were predecessors that were, as much as we like to think we're the ones who invented the sun, the moon, and the stars, someone else was out there trying to do something similar. Someone else was in a similar organization, a similar company, similar product, similar widget. You are not the first, and you won't be the last. What would it look like to actually stretch your scope of history and to imagine yourself in kinship with people who maybe aren't even around anymore, people who are not at the company anymore, people who were there, sat in your chair many, many moons before. I remember years ago, I sat with somebody who had just taken a senior clergy role at a very, very large institution, very, very large faith institution. And I asked her, what's it like? We did a long tour of the building, and I was just trying to get in her head, like, hey, what's this like? What's this like for you? She has responsibility. It's a very old institution with a lot of pressure on you. And she had given this long list. I want to change this, and I want to fix this, and these are my first 6 months in office. This is what I'm going to do. And I said, that's a long list. Like, how do you feel about all that? And she said, this desk I'm sitting at, this desk is 150 years old. And I know that when my predecessors sat here at this desk, that he must have said, gosh, there is a long list of things to do, and it's all on my shoulders. And that someday, 30 years after that, as he was retiring and a new young person was coming in to take over that job, that person probably sat at this desk and said, gosh, I can't believe that my predecessor didn't fix A, B, and C, and D. And she said, so what I genuinely understand is that this desk has been around longer than I have, and it will be around longer than I will. But I feel deeply connected to every person who has sat at this desk and every person that they served for the last 150 years in and around and beyond our community. And if I can keep that sense of connection, groundedness, rootedness, both in where I'm at now and what I want to accomplish, but also where we've come from, then anything becomes possible for whatever my next 10, 20, 30 years are in this role.
So would you say that you try to talk to organizations about both being future oriented, like this is where we're going, like having a vision for their team, for their place, but also this is where we've been. This is the legacy you're a part of, or something like that?
Absolutely. Really, what I try to invite folks to do is make sure that every employee, every person within the organizational ranks, no matter what shape the organization is, right? Whatever your org chart looks like, circle, square, pyramid, doesn't matter. I want to make sure that every single person feels like they're a part of something bigger than themselves. Ultimately, I can tell you, to a person, if you walked to 100 people on the street, right, and you really dug down and you were able to ask the kind of questions that would get to the answer of that question, every single person wants to feel like they are part of something that is bigger than themselves. It's part of why, because of this large erosion in social gathering spaces that we've seen, this sort of de-churching of younger generations of Americans, why they are so susceptible to cult-like groups, right? Cult-like conspiracy theories. It's why QAnon has been so enticing, I think, because it gives you a sense that you are now a part of something bigger than yourself. There's always the us and them in those contexts, right? But when you're a leader of a company, you obviously don't need to resort to the tactics of a cult leader or a conspiracy theorist, but you can invite someone to genuinely feel like the us that you are now a part of is bigger than you could possibly ever imagine.
I love it. I love it. So how does this relate to your new book on leadership? Could you make that connection for listeners? Like, what are you talking about in this new book? What kind of leadership are you advocating for? I think it probably has something to do with what you were just saying.
Thank you so much for the cue. My publisher, I'm sure, is smiling upon you right now because I always forget to. So this book is it's called "Picking Up the Pieces: Leadership After Empire," and it imagines a world. It sort of proposes these different models of leadership that are non-hierarchical, that are non-coercive, that are non-extractive. And the argument here is like everything that we think we know about leadership, we learned from Pharaoh, right? when things got tough, Pharaoh moved the goalposts. Pharaoh also had no history, right? The Pharaoh that caused all this was a new Pharaoh rose up who didn't know Joseph, which meant that he didn't even study his father's notes on how to be a leader and who his partners are. He just immediately said, those people, let's enslave them and let's, move the goalposts on them for 430 years. Most of what we know about the ways that leadership could and should work in the world, especially in a hyper-capitalized capitalist society that we live in, is coercive. It is shaped like the pyramids, right? It's the org charts where there's the one person at the top and maybe two or three on the next level and so on and so forth. And you see cascading, declines in agency and power and voice the closer you get to the bottom. The argument here is that not only is that oppressive for the people at the bottom, that's an easy argument to make, but it's also deeply oppressive for the people at the top. That we are watching a generation of CEOs burn out. We are watching a generation of companies fail faster than we can possibly have ever predicted, right? No economist pictured that this many high-level, multi-million-dollar companies, Forbes 500 companies, were going to close this fast, and they have. And a lot of it is about the failures of leadership at the top, because as it turns out, there's something called the power paradox. That it is that your brain actually changes as you gain more power. And the one thing you lose, the closer you get to the top of the corporate ladder, corporate pyramid, whatever, is the ability to mirror and read emotions. The closer you get to the top, the less
that tracks. For any of us who've been
right. You're like,
under somebody who has a lot of power, that tracks. Yeah.
Right. And you're thinking like, oh my gosh, yeah, that was my last boss and their boss too. And that's what's so the things that it took to get to the top of the pyramid: empathy, mirroring other emotions, reading the room, working with others, collaborating, partnering, so on. Those all go out the window as soon as you get to the top. Why? Because your job is to stay at the top. Now, what does that mean in terms of belonging? That rather than just shining this negative light and this harsh critique on the world as it is, we also like to develop a vision for the world as it could. And we feature stories about 6 different leaders who are breaking the mold. Big institutions, important startups, like these are leaders who are in significant key roles. And what they do, rather than hoarding all of the power at the top, is anytime there's a big decision to make, they have a circle of people they work with. They share power. They are generative in their ideas. They are not pharaonic in their leadership. They are non-coercive. They are non-hierarchical. And the simplest way to do it, simplest. And I think this really has to do with the last stage of belonging, which is to be needed. The single most important thing a leader can do tomorrow is to get curious about the gifts of the people that work at their organization. And I don't just mean like, oh, how can they contribute to the bottom line? No, they will, right? If people experience a sense of belonging, they will be more productive. We know that. But it's about asking, what would it look like for this person to bring all of their gifts in their wholeness, in the fullness of their being, into this organization? And how can I create a platform to elevate those gifts such that A, they feel honored, B, they have impact, and C, this person experiences at the deepest levels of their soul a feeling of being valued. That's all you have to do. The next time you're having a meeting with somebody who reports to you, get a touch more curious about the kind of gifts that they bring into the world. And nothing's out of bounds at that point. Anything's possible.
Yeah. And I feel like that's where employee retention comes in. That's where loyalty of the employee comes in. Is like people, when you feel this sense that I'm noticed, that I'm named, what's the third thing?
Noticed, named, known, and needed.
Right. Known and needed.
Yeah.
Then it's like, I want to be here. It's not, and Brene Brown talks about this in her own work, that like, so that workplaces oftentimes think that the way to keep people around is to give them more money, but that's not even the number one thing for most people. She says the number one thing for most people is that they don't want to have a toxic work culture where they feel like they don't belong and they're like not included and they're being, constantly harassed or marginalized and all this stuff. But the other thing is that they want best practices in like management. They want a management, I think, that does the things that you're talking about. I'm so excited. Listeners, if you want to hear more from Rabbi Babchuck about his work, you can find his book anywhere that books are sold. All right, I'm going to link to it in the show notes, but also you can go to his website, which I'm also going to put in the show notes. to learn more about what your organization does. And as I understand it, you all can help organizations to take a survey, discern how much belonging people are experiencing, and then figure out where the gaps are, and then you all help them. Is that right? You want to say more about that?
Absolutely, yeah. So this is one. I work at a large think tank, and one of the
Mm-hmm.
projects we're running is called the Belonging Project, and we'll make sure to put that link in the show notes.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what we do. We bring that survey. It's a scientific approach, so it's data-based, and then we introduce, using different design thinking methods. We introduce methods for each of those organizations, institutions, or companies to create a deeper and more abiding sense of belonging for their people, right? For the people that they
Yeah.
care most about.
So great. As we're wrapping up together today, I would just love my last sort of question for you is, or thought for you to reflect on is, what do you hope is your own legacy when you think about the stories that have made you and the stories that you want to pass on? Like what's at the heart of that story?
Hmm. It's really simple, and you've probably heard it a million times. But it's just to leave the world a touch better than it was when I got here.
Mm.
I don't know that I would call this a blessing, although it's now 21 years since this happened. But I was pretty young. I was in a pretty formative age when my father passed away.
Mm.
And one of the last conversations that I had with him was essentially about what my career path. I was an entrepreneur at the time. I was running a company. We had grown. It was great. We scaled it. And essentially the last thing he said to me before he went into a coma was to find something that's going to light my soul on fire. And if I can find that, then there's no question I'll be able to leave the world a touch better than it was when I found it, because I'll be fully alive doing that work.
Mm-hmm.
It took me a long time to really understand what he meant and how he meant it and where to find it. But I thank God every day that I get to do that work, and that I get to extend his legacy that he left before me, which was to make a commitment to doing that. And he passed away when he was 58. I'm 41 now, and I've always had 58 circled on my calendar. It's like, man, if I can't really stand on solid ground and say that I did something by then. So I've got an action forcing event on my calendar, 17 years to go, and God willing, I'll have a lot more, but working hard every day.
I think that you can rest assured, sleep well tonight, that you're doing incredible work in the world. I'm really grateful for you and your team's research on ways to think about leadership that will move us forward and that'll be better for people's lives, but also thinking about belonging and how to nurture more of it in people's lives, which is really about helping people to have a deeper sense of self. And so thank you so much for being with me today, with all of us. And thanks to the listeners for being with us too.
Thank you. What a gift.